Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's December 10, 2018, and this is episode 641. Today we start a series of Travelogue style episodes to walk you through my 2018 Morocco tour and workshop, which was great despite the trouble I had getting into the country that I mentioned in the previous post. Luckily, the stress of almost losing all of my photography gear to the customs officials on entry to Morocco didn't spoil my trip, although it did leave a nasty taste in my mouth. If you didn't catch that, check out the previous episode, which was at mbp.ac/640. Before we jump into this first travelogue though, I'd like to make a short announcement about my favourite photo editing software. Last week, Phase 1 released Capture One Pro version 12, and it has some very nice new features. I will be creating some content to walk you through some of this stuff in the coming weeks, but today I just wanted to briefly run through some of the highlights. Capture One Pro 12 now has even better colour, faster performance, more creative control due to the new radial, linear and luma range masks, a more refined user interface that's even more efficient and intuitive to use, and what's more, Phase 1 has added the long-awaited ability to develop plugins for Capture One, and the implications of that are huge. We can expect to see all sorts of goodies as various companies are now able to get inside Capture One. I've already started playing with the Luma range masks on some of my Morocco images, and they are really useful for refining the areas that your mask is applied to. More on that with the first image that we'll look at in a moment. Performance hasn't been an issue for me at all, but I can confirm too that version 12 certainly feels more responsive. There's just no lag as I work on my images. I'm happier than ever to be working with Capture One Pro. Anyway, I won't talk about this too much for today, as I have some dedicated content coming up. Check out version 12 at captureone.com/12 though, and by all means download the trial and take it for a spin. I know that you'll like what you see. So on to Morocco, where we kicked off our tour on the first afternoon in Casablanca with a shoot at the Hassan II Mosque, as we see in this photo. To follow along with the photos if you're not using a device which will let you actually see the images as we go along, you can go to the blog and check the images out there at mbp.ac/641. I've made this first image a before and after type photo so that you can grab the vertical bar in the middle of the image and move it left to right to see the difference between my original processing and the updated processing, using Capture One Pro 12's new Luma range mask to increase the contrast in the sky. To create the mask, I first created an adjustment layer and used the gradient tool to fill the top half of the screen from the horizon with a mask. Then I hit the Luma range button under the layers palette. Then using the Luma range nodes, I adjusted the range and the fall off until I had a mask that covered most of the darker areas of the sky, but left the whiter parts of the clouds out of the mask, or only partially masked. I did have to refine the mask to get it clean around the edges of the mosque and along the horizon, but the selection with the sky all comes from the Luma range mask, as you can see in this next photograph. This gives us much more control over the areas of the photo that we will adjust and results in a more natural looking black and white sky than the old method, where even the whiter parts of the sky could become a little bit darker as I adjusted the sliders and tone curve, etc. Another very nice touch is that even after you hit the apply button and close the Luma Range dialog, you can click the Luma Range button in the Layers palette again to reopen and adjust your settings, if necessary. So kudos to the Phase 1 team for their work on this new feature. For the photo itself, I was using an aperture of f16 for an 1/8 of a second exposure with ISO 100. I allowed the shutter speed to drop that low so that I would capture just a little bit of movement in the crashing of the waves in the foreground. I also shot a few frames with 2-minute shutter speeds to completely smooth over the sea and record some movement in the clouds, but on this occasion I think I prefer this version to the long exposure. As we photographed the Hassan II Mosque from a distance, it started raining, and by the time we had driven over to walk into the square to photograph the mosque in more detail, it had become a pretty substantial shower. So the mosque wasn't teeming with worshippers as it was last year, but the reflections in some of the stone floors were beautiful. So we felt relatively fortunate to get a chance to photograph the mosque in the rain. Here is just one more shot from this first afternoon, as a lady turned, probably to check that I wasn't photographing her, as she walked across the courtyard. I wasn't necessarily photographing the woman, but her clothing matched the colour of the mosaics on the base of these foreground pillars, so I couldn't resist including her in the shot like this. My settings were f11 for a 40th of a second at ISO 6400. The following day we started our drive to Chefchaouen, stopping on the way at the Chela Necropolis ruins, where I flipped my wildlife photographer switch on for an hour to get a shot of the beautiful white storks that nest on the top of the buildings. In this image, you can see that I was able to capture 3 storks as 2 of them took flight from the top of a minaret. I feel that you literally have to switch from one target genre to another when you do wildlife on an otherwise landscape and cultural photography trip. I not only attached my 100 to 400mm lens to my camera, but I had to switch to AI servo or continuous focus mode and increased my shutter speed to a 1600th of a second at ISO 640 for this photo. Then it takes a few minutes to make yourself more alert so that you don't miss the moment when something like this happens. I can assure you that I would not have been fast enough to catch this moment had they done it 5 minutes earlier, while I was still getting into my wildlife mode. Not far from the ruins, we made a stop at Rabat, the political capital of Morocco, to visit the mausoleum of Mohammed V, the King of Morocco until 1961. This is a photo of one of the guards on each of the 4 doors to the mausoleum, and they are usually very receptive to having their photographs taken by tourists. These guys are always so well presented, and I like the contrast between the colour of their hats and tunic, and even the laces around the tunic buttons is set off nicely against the red. The blue hat is also separated nicely by the white band. My settings for this were f2 for an 800th of a second at ISO 100. I was using my Canon EF 85mm f1.4 lens and stopped it down just a little bit for this photograph. After this, we spent most of the rest of the afternoon continuing our drive to Chefchaouen, the Blue City, where we would spend the next 2 nights. Chefchaouen has to be one of the most photographic cities in the world, with house after house painted in a beautiful sky blue colour. I'm going to drop the first 3 photos from here into a gallery for formatting purposes. I'm now using WordPress 5.0 for the blog, and with the new Gutenberg editor, although it's fun, it will lead to a few formatting changes moving forward. If you look at all three of these images, you'll notice that they all have the signature Chef Chow in blue throughout all of the images, but then they also all have a splash of red, which I think helps to set off the blue even more. As with last year, I tend to try to work in aperture priority mode in Morocco and set my aperture according to the scene and amount of available light. But then I also turn on auto ISO so that the camera has more freedom to do its thing, rather than being forced to use a slower shutter speed. In fact, I set my minimum target shutter speed to a 250th of a second, and the camera will only drop below that if the ISO starts to creep up too high. My settings for the first of these three images was f8 for a 250th of a second at ISO 4000, and that was with +1 exposure compensation. The second of the three was shot at f11 for a 320th of a second at ISO 1600 with +0.3 stops of exposure compensation. And the third image was shot at 320th of a second at f11 with +0.7 stops of exposure compensation, which gave me an ISO of 6400. As I've mentioned in the past, you don't see any grain in shots like this, even at ISO 6400, because the high ISO has helped me to expose to the right, so the images are so bright that grain is not visible. Conversely, if you worry about grain and leave your ISO too low, recording a darker image, you'll actually see more grain. So you have to push through the grain barrier, as it were. This next photo shows a typical flight of steps winding their way through this idyllic little town. I chose this particular moment to release the shutter because of the position of the man in the jalaba, partway down the steps. The people in Morocco don't really like you taking their photo, so quite a lot of the time you end up having to either sneak them into the photo like this or paying for the photo, either of which I don't really mind doing. For this photo, I also used the keystone correction tools in Capture One Pro to remove some of the distortion caused by the 24mm wide angle of my Canon EF 24 to 105mm lens, and that also helped me to remove another door that was creeping into the frame on the left, but I had to crop it off to get this composition. My settings were f14 for 125th of a second at ISO 2000. Talking about paying for photos, as we walked through the alleyways of Chefchaouen, we noticed a small gate through which we could see this idyllic little courtyard. Just moments later, a man came out to us and asked for 50 dirham each for the photo. As you can see, I have the photo, so I obviously paid the man. It's a beautiful little area and I think it was worth it. Only one other member of my group felt the same way, so the man made a whopping 100 dirham from us, and that's about 10 cents US. You know, many of these people aren't rich or even well off, and although I am not either, I'm not struggling, so I don't mind paying for photos here and there. I did have to think for a while though about whether or not I was prepared to pay the gentleman in this next and final photo for today a whole 100 dirham for his photo. But once again, I have the photo, so you know my decision. He actually was asking 200 dirham per photo, which is $20 a pop. I wasn't prepared to pay that, but we talked him down to 100 each. He'd probably have done it for less, but I wasn't too concerned. I actually really like the photo. I have another with his face larger in the frame looking head on, but I think I prefer this, with him looking back at me, a little bit more spontaneously than the other pose. He was a businessman though, and literally only gave me and the other guy that paid a minute or so for each of our photos. Actually, when my guest had finished photographing him, he asked me for advice on his photo, and then asked for one more photo to implement my advice, and this man asked for another 100 dirham. We are often generous, but not pushovers, so we got him to pose again for us for free. My settings here were f4.5 for 160th of a second at ISO 400. I was using my 85mm portrait lens for this again. We'll wrap it up there for this first episode of my 2018 Morocco Tour Travelogue series. I like to keep each episode to 10 images, and that's our 10. I'll be back next week with part 2 and some more images from this beautiful country. Thanks very much for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favourite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and Google+, etc. And links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com. So do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with the follow-up part 2 episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.